Okay, I thought I'd add this as a World War III update just because I think it's really important to see how things shape. Most people don't think wars happen until tanks roll across borders and uh, airplanes are bombing and bombers are bombing and artillery's blasting and soldiers are dying and people are screaming and people are shitting bricks, whatever might happen. Typical war. And they get the 1,000 yard stare, and then they don't eat Girl Guide cookies anymore. All kinds of bad things happen. So uh, kind of reminds me of this one time in Nam. Uh, all we got was Girl Guide cookies. That's all we had to eat. You ever heard of Girl Guide cookie soup? Yeah, it was horrible. I'm kidding, and no disrespect to anybody that served in Nam. But yeah, anyway, have to throw some humor into life, or else, like Bugs Bunny said, don't take life so seriously. You'll never get out alive. But if it isn't clear to people now that we are going to war with Russia, who's going to actually fire the opening shots? Nobody really knows at this point. But you can really tell that the Russians are nervous by all the. I mean, they've reactivated one of their nuclear trains. This picture here is just kind of like one of the older ones. So they're putting modern nukes on their trains, and they have trucks and cargo ships and stuff like that that can also fire nukes. So the Russians, like what they lack for in technology, they make up for in sneakiness. you know, so that's just one of the things to keep in mind. So they are definitely going to be a formidable foe. And the thing is they just passed a thing in the Congress. Okay, basically last week they declared war on Russia, basically in a kind of an abstract way, but it's still a declaration of war when you look at it. Now, if anything is going to kick off an actual shooting war, and I know there's a lot of people don't believe they'll ever get to that goal. They'll never take it that far, but you have to understand the goal is probably not a full thermonuclear exchange. But the goal is to destabilize Russia because Russia is about the. If Russia had no weapons, okay, and they didn't have an army, they didn't have anything, this plan would be a bust because Russia could put up a fight for a long time. And again, war is a racket. What they really want is just a regional war in Europe. Not even up to England. They want basically anything that hugs the uh, they want like a stalemate kind of war along the Russian borders with any countries that are, Estonia, Latvia. Who else is on the border there? Obviously, the Ukraine, and any Georgia, all those countries that are kind of hugging that border, even probably even up to Hungary, going out that far, and probably even what you call Lithuania would probably get into this. That's where they want to put the war. They want to put it in that region. This might even include Poland, and it'll probably include Finland as well. So they want that area to start fighting. Yeah, Poland's going to get thrown under the bus. Poland right now, sure, is the big NATO landing spot, but they would love to see war there because they know they can defend that position, sure, but from the Russians. But the thing is that they want a regional war in Europe to re-kickstart the economies. Kill off a bunch of people, then you don't have as, it's a lot easier to pay for a funeral for a veteran than it is to pay for his health costs when he comes back all messed up. Just to kind of put things in perspective for you. And you see this every day pretty much on the news now where Veterans Affairs are making cuts, or maybe not just making cuts, but the people aren't getting the help they need after going and serving their country, and yet they're throwing money out to this country, that country, like a bunch of drunken sailors. So you got to ask, how come they always have the money? Why does government always have the money to fund the things they want to fund without asking the people? We're going to put 500 million here, 600 million there, 2 million there, 20 million there. Oh, but when you want your pensions and stuff, we got to cut those back. Oh, healthcare, we got to cut that back. So you see what I mean? It's really a racket. Now, what's recently just passed, and again, this is, you know, before World War II kicked off, lots of things happened with pen and ink, and that's what you're seeing right now is the pen and ink aspect of the war. So we've already went through currency war. We're somewhere in the middle of trade war. After that comes shooting war. Problem is the Russians, like I covered in my last video, if we're lucky and this is all just a big scheme, then there will be no nuclear war. And that, that's fine. You can dodge the draft. If you're an American, you must know this by now. If you don't know this, yes, the draft has been enacted by the NDRP. That's the thing. The NDAA is bad enough, but you really need to check out that NDRP. It's the biggest resource grab in history, and it also is basically incites the draft So you will be basically and now that your daughters can get their guts blown out on the front lines too, not politicians' daughters. Like the Obama girls are never going to go fight in a war, but everybody else's daughters are now going to get some equality on the battlefield. So and you won't have a choice in this. And this is already legal. Okay, now what they have done to really kind of seal the deal to get ready for the shooting war is basically by and they didn't do this in Afghanistan when the Russians back in the 1970s, early 1980s, when they didn't make anything official. It was all proxy war. Basically, the CIA gave weapons to the Mujahideen. It taught them how to use Stinger missiles. Hence why in Desert Storm, Stinger missiles were shooting down Apache helicopters. They were wondering, at first, everybody was thinking it was friendly fire incidents, and then they realized, no, these jihadists have American-made weapons. Where did they get them? That's usually the first thing you have to question about any of these wars that you see anywhere. These wars would not be possible if it wasn't for big governments funding them. Even these guys over in the Middle East, if you stop giving them ammo, those AKs will just become really fancy clubs. And now that they have even fancier clubs, M16s, American-made M16s, people got to ask, well, where did they get those? And the first it's going to be, oh, well, they raided weapons caches that were left behind when the U.S. left Iraq. But here's the problem with that, is that the Army leaves and they just leave all their weapons there? No, they didn't. They gave these weapons to people that they trained. Basically, we train the people we fight in the future. And we'll be doing this again in Ukraine. Ukraine is the line in the sand for the Russians. If this isn't a bluff and they're just trying to get regime change in Russia or a regional European war going, they don't realize the miscalculation that this is going to lead to. Yes, the Russians will put up. They won't shut up. They will put up. Yes, they will launch nuclear weapons. Now, the thing is this. What kind of makes this proxy war? Right now, it's a proxy war between Russia and the United States. This is the first time you've had a kind of extremely direct proxy war, where yes, the war against Afghanistan, the Russians had against Afghanistan was covert between the CIA and the Mujahideen, which later got overrun by the Taliban, and then basically the Taliban is the Mujahideen, kind of how the Free Syrian Army is ISIS. They are, it's humble beginnings, right? So anyway, the problem is that this time you have a direct destabilization of a government. Just something to put you. This has been a long time coming. This is something that NATO has wanted to do for a long time: is overthrow and get a hold of the Ukraine. And there's lots of reasons why. Number one, Ukraine was the number one manufacturer for nuclear weapons. And stuff, and a lot of stuff for Russia. The Ukrainian basically was, Ukraine is basically, the cheap import of cheap labor, right, for the Russians. So they had all kinds of stuff, military stuff made in the Ukraine. Now, to give you an idea of how bad the United States wants to get in here, is we have to look to the Ohio-class nuclear submarines, okay? And one of the things you have to understand, out of the 14 Ohio-class nuclear submarines, I think 7 to 8 of them stay out on patrol at just about any one given time in various places around the globe. On every submarine, okay, there are 2 missiles out of the 14 or 24 Trident missiles. I believe they carry 24 Trident missiles, which carry 3 warheads per missile. Okay, on every submarine, there are 2 missiles that have 3 dedicated targets. I mean, all the other missiles could have all kinds of different targets, but the first target is Moscow on 1 warhead, the second warhead goes to Warsaw, and the third warhead goes to Kiev. So think about that. That's how much of a stake in the game the U.S. has. That's how bad they want this country. So what did Russia have? Well, Russia, they had control of the Ukraine. They pretty much still kind of do to a point. Russia made a deal back in the day that if NATO didn't expand in any, a thumb width further towards the, towards the east, that they would, kind of cool things down, and they did, But NATO has pushed that now. The bad guys here, the instigators in this is, Canada, United States, England, Even Australia will be in on this. Just about every West, definitely. I already said England, but we're the bad guys here. Why? Because we're pushing World War III is what we're doing, and how we're doing it is you have to understand too that we're doing this through proxy, but we're doing it very overt. How this is happening is basically they had a very corrupt leader but unelected leader in, and Fabian for Liberty just kind of said the same thing in a previous video he did, that even though the guy was corrupt, he was elected. Okay, so he was elected and the people were unhappy with it. The EU deal comes along, he shoots it down. Now Russia says, openly, why does it have to be either or either? Why does the deal have to be either with Russia or the Ukraine? It can't be both. Now, behind the scenes, I'm sure both of them are thinking either. Either make the deal with us or make the deal with them. But the bottom line comes down to is you had a democratically elected, even if they were corrupt to the core, and the new guys know better. He's actually worse. He's got his country in a civil war, but he's a puppet. So the other guy gets ousted through the coup, the Maidan protest, which, yes, those protesters are still there, and yeah, nobody cares about them now. Why? Because the bankers have the Ukraine. Canada's role in this seems to be the mining. But if you look at all the IMF bankers that are pretty much stealing everything, Yatsenuk is an IMF banker, so that's a Rothschild banker right there. Victoria Nuland pretty much, spearheaded this campaign to do this coup. Now, of course, once this coup happens, they say it was democratic and everything like that. But then when the Crimea, which is what they were really after, where that whole region on the west, on the other side of the Kiev is basically where all the mining and all that stuff is. So basically, they don't want the Russians to have access to that, but most importantly, they don't want them to have that naval port. Now, right now, in Crimea, the reason why you're seeing all the fighting in Donetsk and Lugansk and all that area there is not so much because it's the pro-Russian sides there. It's because they're not heavily armed there. That's where the mining is. So they're going. It's kind of the idea: if we can't have it, nobody can. So Russia wants that corridor going down to the Crimea. That's a guarantee. But the thing is that the bankers, they want that, and that's what they paid for. That's what they want. That's why you have Poroshenko come out all the time talking about peace, but then breaking his own peace deals. And basically, it's not so bad that they're shelling the rebels over there and innocent civilians. It's that they're shelling pro-Ukrainian people over there. They got the Ukrainian military killing its own people. That's how sick this is. Now, so why don't they just go into the Crimea? Because at the end of the day, that's what they want. Well, this picture sums it up for all. Those are Topol M's. And yes, there's about 4 to 8 of them in the Crimea from the video I looked at. I can't verify 100% that the video is legit. But back in March of 2014, these things made their way into the Crimea. And if you know what a Topol M is, you pretty much know why nobody's going to mess with the Crimea. Also in the Crimea is the S-300 missile systems, which, yes, NATO can take these out, but they can't take them out without losses. And this is what Russia's kind of, factoring in. It's, yeah, they could take us, in a conventional war, they can take us, but they can't take us out without massive losses. Now, while this is all going on, Putin is very clever strategizing what's going on geopolitically around the world. Now, after the G20 meeting, you know about all the alliances that were made there with the Chinese Silk Road. I don't think it's going to work out any better for them than because everybody's corrupt. Every government is corrupt. None of these deals work out as they never work out for the people. In the end. So the problem is that we have all this going on where they're trying to alienate the U.S. simply by not doing trade with it. So more and more sanctions are going against Russia, which is going to hurt Russia in the short term. But the thing is that Russia's making alliances. I don't think they're as hurting as you would think. Here's the proof. Yes, the Russian ruble has lost a lot of value. However, they've paid off 95% or 90% of the Cuban debt. Okay, even in Russian rubles, that's a lot of money. Okay, they've paid off 90% of the North Korean debt, and now they have just paid off 95% of the Uzbekistan debt. And anybody has any doubt that's the new Cold War. This is new Cold War 2.0 enhanced. The divide and conquer is now turned into uh, basically bribe and conquer. I guess it's a bribe and conquer. That's what you're seeing around going around now. So Russia, ask yourself this: a country who is, really broke, to begin with, they've never put any of their, they've never put much back into their people, uh, you know, building up all these military arms, and has just recently added, within the last few months, a new class of submarine, two submarines. They have the Bori class boomer sub, which is the replacement for the Akula Typhoon. It's very advanced. There's a picture of it here. And then, of course, they've got a new K328 or 329 is the Yazan class attack sub. And it basically looks like an Akula 2, but a little more kind of advanced. It took them 20 years to get this thing on the go, but they've got it in the water. And there's a plan for about 12 submarines, I think, in total, maybe a little more. Don't quote me on the number, but something like that. And this will be their new backbone of the fleet. That said, so Russia has money. Even their cheapest submarine is billions and billions of dollars. Okay. So they can afford all these military drills. They can afford paying off the debts of all these countries. Are they really broke? It's like I said back in the 90s. I think back in the 90s, a lot of people, were deceived. Yes, the Russian people suffer. The people always suffer when big governments do these kind of things. But look at the military equipment now. If they really did collapse in the 90s, they could not afford the stuff they have now. All they did back in the 90s is divert the debt to the military-industrial complex and basically sell the resources to oligarchs for pennies on the dollar. Kind of what you're seeing in the United States now. There's no difference. It's the same play. So with all this going on, you have Washington, and some people in Washington, I think maybe it's false patriotism, a mass amount of stupidity, and then some ego, and then some, others just miscalculating, thinking that they can have a, war with Russia without it going nuclear. It's not possible. Russia will not be defeated that way. They will not be defeated in a World War II style war. They'll fight that maybe for a few months, but they will not allow their country to fall. They'll kill everybody before they allow that to happen. Yes, everybody in this game at the top of the chair, at the top of the castle, are lunatics. They are ultra narcissistic, nihilist lunatics. Try to say that 10 times fast. But that's what they are. So yeah, they will take it to that level. They don't care about your kids. You know what I mean? They won't. They're not. If the pissing contest has went this far, they're going to take it all the way. The thing is I don't think the West really realizes what they have done with the new Ukrainian support or defense bill, whatever. I forget the name of the actual thing. They just put it out in the Congress today. But basically, what this allows, and this is the start of the war. This is this is the start of getting into the shooting aspect of the war, which will probably take place fairly, maybe within a year or so. Who knows? I mean, it could happen tomorrow morning. It could happen in 5 seconds from now. But basically what they have done is agreed to arm the Ukraine. So what that means, okay, is now this is no longer a proxy war. This is direct involvement. This is written on paper. 400 and some voted in favor and 10 against the bill, okay, which allows military weapons to go to the Ukraine. This is choosing a side. This is on the record. This is war. And it's also treasonous if you think about it. Declaring war on another country, I think, is the ultimate act of treason when that country hasn't done anything to you. Now, saying, no, they're just supporting. Look, France supported Hitler. How did that work out? And again, it wasn't the people, but the government supported Mussolini in Italy. He supported Hitler. How did that work out? You know what I mean? It didn't really work out the way they thought it was going to work out, did they? Switzerland stayed neutral. How did that work out? Not too bad for them. Ireland, okay, because they hated the British, they opened up the ports to the Germans, but other than that, they pretty much stayed out of it. Sure, there was lots of Irish boys that went and fought too, but you get the idea. The thing is that what's not being understood here is that these politicians are lunatics. You can only blame so much on incompetence. This is so deliberate. How could not one rational how could 400 of them be that irrational? That can only happen through two ways. Either they're all in on it from the beginning and they're complete, the globalists, which I don't think it's that, because you can't organize that many people to be, to not look at it. I think stupidity has more to do with it. You don't declare war on Russia. It's just a really bad idea. And yes, Canada is now, whatever the United States does, we're along on that ride too. Just keep that in mind. We're not separate here. We are basically the same country. Different flags, different, and there's a border, but the battlefield is Canada. It always was that way. That's what NORAD's all about. We always understood that the Russians will be coming over the North Pole. Now they will also. Alaska is probably the land bridge, but the airplanes will be flying pretty much directly over Canada. So we're in on this no matter what. The battlefield is Canada. Now the thing is too is you have to also understand is that Russia isn't Saddam Hussein. Okay, yeah, Saddam had a lot of old Soviet technology and stuff like that, and not all the old Soviet technology is really that much of a threat in a lot of ways. But in numbers, it is a threat. The other thing that's a big threat is the fact that their newer stuff, even though it's in lower numbers, is pretty darn good. Stealth aircraft are a sham. They don't really work. This is something that you're probably going to be slightly blown away by. But the first internet system, okay, next to the telegraph, was basically radar in World War II. Low frequency radar, which the British used to detect German Luftwaffe coming across the English Channel. And it worked fairly well. That's one of the main things that was attributed to the Battle of Britain, was the idea that even though heavily outnumbered 4-1 for the RAF, they knew when to launch the airplanes. They didn't have to spend more time in the air burning up fuel they didn't have. They could launch later. Say, wait till the Donner bombers and the Heinkels get halfway across the channel before you send up the fighters. So the fighters had more time in the fight because they weren't burning up a lot of fuel just sitting there waiting for the enemy to come. Although there was patrols and stuff, but they could do this, okay, because they had the ability to see the enemy coming. Now that's World War II, okay, and that's old radar. However, the thing about stealth aircraft is that type of radar, that old World War II low frequency radar, mind you, a highly advanced version, is what the Russians have tons of. They have low frequency radar, which is excellent at detecting stealth aircraft. How they detect stealth aircraft is by not looking for what's there, they look for what's not there. They look for, basically, if you watch a boat go through water, you'll see the wake of the boat right behind it. Well, when an aircraft moves through the air, same thing happens. They look for the heat signature from the exhaust, temperature differences moving along. So these low frequency radars can pick up the stealth aircraft. So the stealth aircraft are not as advanced as you think. Although they're an advantage, they're not the be all end all. The Russians build a lot of junk, okay, but they build stuff that works as well, and they got large numbers of stuff that works well enough. The T-72 would be a good example of this. Not the best tank in the world, but the 15 to 18,000 of them that they built, you know what? They do pretty good in battalion force. They will lose a lot of them, but the overwhelming numbers. Just like in World War II, Germany had the superior Tiger tank. The terror factor of the Tiger tank was off the charts for the Allies. They were blowing up the Tommy burners or the Sherman tanks 4-1. But the thing is there was only 1,300 Tiger tanks. There was over 10,000 or around 10,000 Sherman tanks. So it was just numerical superiority, even though in the slightly inferior tank. Now I know things are a lot different from World War II. Everything's more digital than analog, but at the end of the day, you're still numbers game. The Russians make stuff, even if it doesn't work as advertised, there's lots of it and it works well enough. Now, can they take NATO? No, they can't take NATO in a conventional war. NATO outnumbers them as a whole. So what Russia's plan is really is to break up NATO. That's NATO is using the Ukraine to become relevant, but that can also backfire them. And if they start breaking up NATO, this is a good thing. because then the confidence and the bullying is gone, and then it's okay. Well, maybe we'll negotiate with Russia rather than, or just leave them be. Like I say, if you don't like these countries, just don't do business with them. That's one thing. But think about it. And this is something that nobody can actually answer for you. What is our purpose in the Ukraine? It's not for democracy and the women and children like in Iraq and Afghanistan that they always say. It's about, fighting terrorism and terrorists and stuff like that, which is a crock, because those people can't get to you. They can't get to you. They're over there. They're dirt poor. The only way they can get somewhere is if somebody pays for them. And even at that, most of them, they fight on their own turf to protect their homes. They're not coming over here to blow us up. Not to mention, that's why we're seeing radicals over here, because these radicals were already here, and they're just upset what we're doing to their homelands. And I know a lot of people don't like it to hear it that way, but foreign policy is what makes the world so dangerous. It's what makes it so dangerous. Now, by arming the Ukrainian military, okay, yes, these guys, they don't realize right now that they're cannon fodder. They don't realize that they're being used. The West is not going to come to the aid of the Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be basically squashed, flattened like a bug in a war that might draw out for, if it doesn't go nuclear, it'll draw out for the next 20 years. The idea is what they're getting out of the Ukraine. Number one is they get to launder the gold through the Ukraine. Basically, they stole the Ukrainian gold. The IMF basically went, somehow the FBI ended up there removing boxes from Ukrainian banks. And of course, what ended up happening is their gold is gone. The Ukrainians are like, where's our gold? And all of a sudden, they start buying more gold for the Ukraine. And this stuff ends up going to Switzerland to be melted down. Why? Because the United States owes a ton of gold to countries who want it back. They don't have it. It's the same reason why France is bombing places in Mali, so that they can get the gold reserves. It's about stealing the resources. So this is one thing. The next thing is the $18 trillion deficit, which really is more like $200 trillion deficit when you add up all the liabilities, okay, pensions, stuff like that in the United States. It's stuff that cannot be paid for. They can push the Ponzi scheme as far as they can with the banks, but the problem is that people are just starting to notice that everybody's becoming gradually poor. So even if the economy doesn't collapse, which I don't think it'll, I agree with Joe Scalzo, there will be no collapse, no economic collapse. That's good, right? No, the collapse comes when the war comes. So the thing is if you're still buying into Russia bad, U.S. good, or even Canada good, when we're concerned to the Ukraine, understand that this is an orchestrated war, like World War I, like World War II. There is no difference. These things can't happen unless governments use their pens and papers and Obama's cell phone, or whatever. And again, this is all about stealing the wealth from the people, stealing the resources, stuff like that. Again, they really don't realize that with what Russia does have, yes, it's not as good as the stuff that the West, like the Americans make. And but the thing is, it's the numbers. China doesn't have the numbers in military equipment. Russia does. That's why they're after Russia. China will be relatively easy to take out in a conventional war. Thing is both Russia and China will not go conventional. They're going to go nuclear. It might go conventional for a little while, but if Russia starts losing, the nukes will fly. The nukes will fly. This is the miscalculation on behalf of the West, not on behalf of Putin. Putin is only responding to the West. For example, if they would have just let the Ukraine election go, they probably would have freely elected Poroshenko, and the country probably would not be in a civil war right now. I'm not saying it would be a perfect haven, but you can't tell me that Ukraine is better off now than what it was. I mean, the people are being killed left, right, and center. But notice how that the people are only being shelled and bombed, and the fighting is only on one side of the country. Well, this is done by purpose. This is Russia's strategy. The idea is that if they were to go and start, for example, doing rebel attacks in Kiev and on the other side, and make it a full-scale blown civil war, well, then it would give NATO an excuse to come in, which NATO is slowly creeping in anyway. Mission creep, okay? But they would also, by doing this, they can just drag this out, and again, if they can't have it, nobody can. So the Russians are not good in this. Neither are the Americans. And the Ukrainian government is a puppet of the Western banking system. It's Ukraine and Russia have a lot of bad blood between them, sure. Uh, but that's really not, there's no Canadian or American that really has a dog in this fight. It's the politicians that put it. Now, yes, in Canada we have 1.2 million Ukrainian descendants here. The most Ukrainians outside of the Ukraine, but most of these people were born in Canada. They're just Ukrainian descendants from after the Bolshevik uprisings and stuff like that. There was, also in the a bunch of uprisings in the 1930s that a lot of Ukrainians came to Canada for as refugees. So that's why we have so many Ukrainians here. Well, I don't know how many Russians we have here. We probably have quite a few, considering Russia is one of our neighbors. They're not a really close neighbor, but there's probably, quite a few Russians here as well. So we pick one side, tell one side, the Ukrainian side, okay, well, we support you, but we don't, the Russians are bad. So again, we're dividing our own country by taking this rather than taking a neutral approach. But none of this would be happening had the coup not been done. And this coup is, again, the line in the sand. Just if I go back to the first video I covered on that Ukrainian incident, almost everything is playing out the way I said it would play out. Now, I still think, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I do believe that we are very ripe for a war to break out within the next 3 months. Why? The paperwork is there now. We now have the arming of the Ukraine. And in that paper, what they were saying is basically what they agreed to is not only to arm the Ukrainians, but to support them. That means boots on the ground at some point. Kind of like how Obama said there'd be no boots on the ground on ISIS, and then they're up to like 8,000 people now over there that are just advisors. Yeah, no, that's boots on the ground. But the difference is, and this is the miscalculation that people need to understand. With all the superior military might that the U.S. has, okay, they can't beat a bunch of ragtag jihadists with rusted out AKs living in caves. Okay, they can't beat those guys. The guys that don't have tanks, the guys that don't have an air force, the guys that don't have. They've got plain clothes, which is an excellent weapon because you can blend in, and they got rusted out AKs. And now they have brand new shiny American-made M16s, and they call themselves ISIS. If we can't beat those guys in 13 years, okay, how the heck can we beat Russia, who is armed to the teeth? Yeah, their stuff isn't quite as nice, but they're armed to the teeth. We cannot fight them without taking massive losses. And at what point do we start throwing, where's this brave law enforcement military? They got to start throwing politicians in jail. It's not the people asking to go to war. It's politicians telling you have to go to war to fight for, the most insane reasons. There's nothing about patriotism, provoking the bear. There's just no patriotism there. It's just stupidity. Now the Russians are nervous. They're scared. They know that they want regime change over there. They know that the West is coming for them. They know NATO's coming for them. The sanctions will hurt Russia for a bit, but it's not. Again, when they're paying off other people's debts. 95% of their debts, it's even if on the scale of things, the debts of Cuba, the debts of Uzbekistan and North Korea might not really be that big in considering, but it's still, where did they get this money? Again, they never, this kind of sort of proves that Russia never really collapsed. It just diverted the cash for future war. And that's exactly what the United States is doing. Now, this also comes at a time, okay, when they're buying, and I can't, stress this enough, but the bankers are terrified right now. The average banker that knows what's really going on is terrified. They're not only are they getting extra security, but now they're getting something like $20 million or $200 million or whatever. I can't remember the exact number of funding for emergency kits for bankers. Something like 3,800 emergency kits. Well, why are they buying this right now? What do they know that we don't? Well, we know what's going on. That they know that people are starting to notice that everybody, even if the economy is in such a great recovery, people are noticing all the store closures. They're noticing all the tens of thousands of people that get laid off every week. They notice the undercutting of labor from mass immigration or open border. They notice this stuff, and they know that societal decay is kicking in. all these attacks you see, like for example, the one in Australia, the one here in Canada, there was a mass shooting, two mass shootings, I think 2 days in a row in the States. These are symptoms of societal decay. You know how I know this? Because I used to play the game Tropico. And at Tropico, if you hit an approval rate of 26% or less, the revolutionaries came out and started shooting up the place. Now, mind you, that was just a video game. But there was some, I think there's some truth to that. When people just get so sick and tired of being sick and tired, when people lose everything, they lose it. And yes, the crazies will always snap first. That's a part of societal decay. Rome is collapsing. So with that going on, the best thing they can do is send people to war. Why? Because number one, it gets a lot of people killed. So then you don't have to worry about the pensions as much. It depopulates. So think of World War One. Let's line a trench up right in front of the enemy with their machine guns, and we'll run straight at them. Let's see how that works out. World War Two, they pretty much didn't do quite as obvious, but kind of the same kind of tactic. Let's run straight at each other, shooting at each other. The only time that was worse was probably like in colonial wars, where let's make sure we have an equal amount of men, with an equal amount of shooting. Let's make sure everybody gets one shot at each other. Line everybody up in nice evenly matched rows and shoot at each other. So anyway, with that said, we're also looking at, again, the bankers who just had the Congress add something like $3 trillion of derivatives. And I'm not a banking guy in the sense of knowing exactly how everything works, but basically the U.S. taxpayer is on the hook to bail out the bankers for $3 trillion when things go awry. Basically, there's your pensions, there's your health care, there's your paved roads, there's your Veterans Affairs. That's where all that money goes. But yet they can still afford to go to war. Doesn't that strike you as odd? And I'm not a type of person that's anti-military. I think every country should have a very solid military. But I also think countries should be sovereign. We have no excuse to be in the Ukraine. But however, if you're Ukrainian and you're watching this, understand you might want to get out of there if you can, because the Ukraine is going to be squashed like a bug. They don't care. The U.S. government does not care what happens to the people of Ukraine. The Canadian government does not care what happens to the people of Ukraine. They care about the resources. They care about the gas. They care about the oil. They care about the naval bases, stuff like that. Again, ask yourself this. Why is the fighting only in the areas such as Lugansk, all that, Donbass, all that area? Why is it only there? Okay, and you can say, well, it's because Russia's sending people across the border and supporting them and stuff like that, and they're sending weapons to the Crimea and sending it in, and you would be correct. Yeah, they are doing that. Yeah, of course they're supporting the rebels. But the thing is why is there no fighting in the Crimea? Well, I'll tell you why. Because Topol-M is there. Because the S-300 missile system's there. Because I can imagine by now there must be a hell of an Russian Air Force build-up there. I can imagine there's a lot more new Navy ships there. Russia's not going to give over. They're not. The Russians only have two Navy ports that are technically they might have three now if you add up Cuba. I'm sure they're going to probably get Cuba and Venezuela to help them out. But basically they have the naval base of Tartus in Syria, and they have in the Crimea. That's the two Russian naval bases that they have that are not in Russian territory. The rest are all Russian territory. Now, it doesn't mean they don't use other people's bases, but these are considered like sovereign Russian bases. They rent these bases. I think they had the deal till 2042 for the Crimea, and then I guess negotiate after that for lease of that base or whatever. But the Russians are giving that up, and they're doing this, and all this is happening again at a time when that Russia is basically building newer stuff. While the Americans really haven't built anything new in the military. Well, they built some new stuff, but they haven't really built that much new stuff. Yes, it's more advanced, but again, the numbers are the numbers, right? So, again, yes, NATO can take, in a conventional war, NATO can take the Russians. And yes, the United States by itself could take the Russians, but they can't take the Russians in a conventional war without, and I mean, if you thought the World War II casualties were bad, I think the weapons are so much more powerful now, even just the conventional weapons. Think about it. A Tupolev Bear, okay? versus the TU-4. I think it was the TU-4. Basically, it was basically like the Russian version of the B-29. Back when the United States and Russians were allies, they could carry bombs powerful enough, 21,000 pound bombs in a B-29. Okay, you can carry about 40,000 pounds of ordnance, including cruise missiles, in a Tu-95 very easily. Uh, Almost every heavy bomber now can carry over, and then of course a B-52 can carry, you know, half the planet. A B-52 can clear a 10-mile strip. They did this in Vietnam. You'd have three B-52s flying, pretty much wingtip to wingtip with a bit of space in between, and they would drop about 100 500-pound bombs. It was unbelievable the amount of firepower that was. There was a guy that did an interview where his platoon was kind of in the wrong place at the right time during one of these B-52 raids, and he survived it, but it killed almost everybody else around him. And he said it was just like unbelievable. Like, number one, while he was stone deaf after that, but he says it was just like, it was hell on earth. It was just people being incinerated by these 500-pound bombs and 1,000-pound bombs. Now, the Russians don't have that kind of heavy lift capability with their bombers, but their bombers are faster. This is the big thing. The Su-34, as we're looking at here, that carries a good wallop. That carries about a good 8,000 pounds of ordnance. The Tu-22 and the Tu-160, you're looking at 40,000 to 60,000 pounds of ordnance. That means they can, do a lot of damage. But that said, is the real damage comes from things like, say, the Frogfoot. Very low tech, but these are basically the Russian equivalent of an A-10. Rockets, they can take out, a lot of area. And if we're talking about a conventional war, we're talking about cities. We're talking about, we're not talking about hilltops on a mountain somewhere where a bunch of cave-dwelling jihadists live. We're talking about downtown London. We're talking about Hamburg. We're talking about Stockholm. We're talking about those type areas. We're talking about Paris. We're talking where real damage can occur, and most of it will be cruise missiles, sure. But if you get the bomb trucks coming in, i.e. the Su-24s, how will come in and these little trucks here, I forget the name of these. Basically, they were called Stalin's orchestras. Basically, the Katyusha rockets. Very low tech, but you have 100 of these trucks. Each, I think, is armed with about 30 or 50 rockets. I can't remember the exact number. That would just be devastating to a modern city. Very low tech. Very low tech. You blow up a truck. They could build probably 100 trucks a day with these Katyusha rockets. It's unbelievably stupid to get into a war with Russia, and not to mention the more precise stuff like artillery, guided weapons. A Tu-22M making a high-speed strike with one of those, wonder bombs in it. I could tell you that would clear a couple of city blocks. I mean, think about that. And then of course, if they ever activate these things, the Typhoons, well, they're planet smashers. So even in a non-nuclear war would be hell on earth. It would be, again, the first things, the way the Russians' air power works is basically, the Su-27s are kind of like the P-51s of the day, where they escort the bombers in. Okay, they get air superiority first. Then after that, in comes the Su-24s and the Su-34s, and they take out, radar, power stations, water filtration plants, that type of thing. Anything that can help, people to survive. And it make life very, very, gas plants, all that type of thing. Next wave comes, if they're actually moving an invasion behind them, would probably come in as, basically the MiG-29s protect the bases. They don't really come in, but would probably be things like the MiG-31. They'll come in real fast. The Russians, basically it was an interceptor, but they redesigned the MiG-30. Well, didn't redesign it, but they just changed it up a bit to make it a strike aircraft as well. Now, as far as the armored columns, well, they'll just roll in, brigade after brigade, but what they will do is, again, using something really inexpensive like the Katyusha rockets to soften up the targets before they roll the tanks in. Plus, they'll pound it with artillery, and then they'll move the tanks in. It's kind of like, they'll just destroy their way to the target. Then after that, if all is lost, then the Topol-Ms go into action. So there's all kinds of, and then of course there's air defense on top of that. Now NATO has kind of the same idea. in their plan as well, in a conventional war. But just look at all the military drills that have been going on in the last past year. Again, we've broken so many records. There's so many things that are not on the mainstream media. How this stuff is not news. Right now, for example, today all they talked about was a terrorist attack in Australia. What they didn't talk about was the fact that they just signed and I'm wondering if that's what happened in Parliament today here in Canada, if they did a similar bill basically supporting lethal aid to the Ukraine, which basically, and support, which means boots on the ground, meaning we're going to war at some point. Russia will definitely have been watching that. So whenever you see these things on the news, especially like this terrorist attack thing, and I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying it happened. And somebody just sent me from Australia sent me, and that's why I love it when you guys get involved too. Is the best way to find out what's going on over there somewhere is when somebody over there somewhere tells you, hey, yeah, by the way, in Australia, while all this was going on, I think they released a budget. I think that's what I read. So it's kind of, you know, they said the last budget really created an uproar. So, again, every time something like this happens and they cover it to nauseum, usually it's a distraction because something else is going on. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a false flag. I'm thinking more no good crisis goes to waste. But that's just the way I see it. And even if it is, some of these things are false flags, it doesn't really matter. It's what's the reaction to it. Well, if the reaction is more tyranny, more war, that's what we're going to have to respond to. And I think at this point, well, we're well past the point where the Titanic has struck the iceberg. We're well past that. I think at this point you have to kind of be thinking a little bit more. This is going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen, but this is going to happen fast when it does. Make sure you have some food put away. Something that you can sit out. Make sure that and there's nowhere on the planet you can really go that's safe. I mean, people thinking in the States, well, I'm just going to head to South America. No, South America hates the United States. You're not going to be able to get away from it. You can't go to Europe because Europe's going to be tied up in the war. You go into Asia, well, you're probably going to be no better off there than you would be in South America. And South America is pretty much, devastated through cartels, communists, and communist dictators and cartels, as I normally say. So with that going on, there's not, you're going to have to sit it out where you are. So I guess that's all I'm going to cover for today. This is really, and of course with the Open Skies Treaty thing that, you have Russian fighters going to be flying over the United States. And I imagine there's a lot of NATO fighters flying over Russia now to say that there's no buildup on the Ukrainian-Russian border. Again, it's a lot of this could be just for show, but when they're putting the pens to paper and it's saying, yeah, we're going to support the Ukraine at any cost, you have to ask, well, why are we supporting the Ukraine in the first place? What is our interest there? And when they give you the BS line about women and children and democracy, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that, considering all that's going on? So the masses are dumbed down because obviously this type of stuff will never ever make it onto the mainstream media. And again, if I'm wrong on something, you guys by all means call me on it. I hope I'm wrong on all this stuff. I hope I'm completely off my rocker. That'd be so much nicer. Might be a little unbalanced if you're off your rocker, but at least it'd be safer. Nobody gets to die in a horrible, horrible war. So with that said, I guess I'll leave it at that. There'll be links down below for anybody who would like to donate to the channel, help to make the channel a bit better and a bit bigger. And, the more I can advance the channel, the better it is for you. I believe there's value in this. And thank you to everybody who has. Also, too, don't hesitate to go over to my WW3, WW in capitals 3 with a capital U updates page on Facebook. That there you can post anything that is related to the geopolitical, basically involving anything with World War III. That's how I found out about this bill that they just passed in Congress. I think it was a YouTube video that's it's something along the line. I'm so bad at this, remembering those type. But I look at so much stuff, I get, But it was along the lines of that Congress declares war on Russia or something like that. So anyway, you're going to hear about it anyway. You're going to hear about it one way or another, I guess. Either through a series of bombing raids or or whatever, or you'll get your draft notice in the mail. I wish I was kidding about that. Again, check out the NDRP. So I'll leave it at that. So rate, subscribe, share, comment, like. Be true to yourself, be true to others, and always, always do the right thing. Have a great day, eh? Hey, hi, and welcome. Okay, I thought I'd add this as a World War III update just because I think it's really important to see how things shape. Most people don't think wars happen until tanks roll across borders and uh, airplanes are bombing and bombers are bombing and artillery's blasting and soldiers are dying and people are screaming and people are, shitting bricks, whatever might happen. Typical war, and they get the 1,000 yard stare, then they don't eat Girl Guide cookies anymore. All kinds of bad things happen. So uh, kind of reminds me of this one time in Nam. Uh, all we got was Girl Guide cookies. That's all we had to eat. You ever heard of Girl Guide cookie soup? Yeah, it was horrible. I'm kidding, and no disrespect to anybody that's served in Nam. But yeah, anyway, have to throw some humor into life, or else, like Bugs Bunny said, don't take life so seriously, you'll never get out alive. But if it isn't clear to people now that we are going to war with Russia, who's going to actually fire the opening shots? Nobody really knows at this point. But you can really tell that the Russians are nervous by all the. I mean, they've reactivated one of their nuclear trains. This picture here is just kind of like one of the older ones. So they're putting modern nukes on their trains, and they have trucks and cargo ships and stuff like that that can also fire nukes. So the Russians, like what they lack for in technology, they make up for in sneakiness. you know, so that's just one of the things to keep in mind. So they are definitely going to be a formidable foe. And the thing is they just passed a thing in the Congress. Okay, basically last week they declared war on Russia, basically in a kind of an abstract way, but it's still a declaration of war when you look at it. Now, if anything is going to kick off an actual shooting war, and I know there's a lot of people don't believe they'll ever get to that goal. They'll never take it that far, but you have to understand the goal is probably not a full thermonuclear exchange. But the goal is to destabilize Russia because Russia is about the. If Russia had no weapons, okay, and they didn't have an army, they didn't have anything, this plan would be a bust because Russia could put up a fight for a long time. And again, war is a racket. What they really want is just a regional war in Europe. Not even up to England. They want basically anything that hugs the uh, they want like a stalemate kind of war along the Russian borders with any countries that are, Estonia, Latvia. Who else is on the border there? Obviously, the Ukraine, and any Georgia, all those countries that are kind of hugging that border, even probably even up to Hungary, going out that far, and probably even what you call Lithuania would probably get into this. That's where they want to put the war. They want to put it in that region. This might even include Poland, and it'll probably include Finland as well. So they want that area to start fighting. Yeah, Poland's going to get thrown under the bus. Poland right now, sure, is the big NATO landing spot, but they would love to see war there because they know they can defend that position, sure, but from the Russians. But the thing is that they want a regional war in Europe to re-kickstart the economies. Kill off a bunch of people, then you don't have as, it's a lot easier to pay for a funeral for a veteran than it is to pay for his health costs when he comes back all messed up. Just to kind of put things in perspective for you. And you see this every day pretty much on the news now where Veterans Affairs are making cuts, or maybe not just making cuts, but the people aren't getting the help they need after going and serving their country, and yet they're throwing money out to this country, that country, like a bunch of drunken sailors. So, you got to ask, how come they always have the money? Why does government always have the money to fund the things they want to fund without asking the people? We're going to put 500 million here, 600 million there, 2 million there, 20 million there. Oh, but when you want your pensions and stuff, we got to cut those back. Oh, healthcare, we got to cut that back. So you see what I mean? It's really a racket. Now, what's recently just passed, and again, this is, before World War II kicked off, lots of things happened with pen and ink. And that's what you're seeing right now is the pen and ink aspect of the war. So we've already went through currency war. We're somewhere in the middle of trade war. After that comes shooting war. Problem is the Russians, like I covered in my last video, if we're lucky and this is all just a big scheme, then there will be no nuclear war. And that, that's fine. You know, you can dodge the draft. If you're an American, you must know this by now. If you don't know this, yes, the draft has been enacted by the NDRP. That's the thing. The NDAA is bad enough, but you really need to check out that NDRP. It's the biggest resource grab in history, and it also is basically incites the draft. So you will be basically and now that your daughters can get their guts blown out on the front lines too, not politicians' daughters, like the Obama girls are never going to go fight in a war, but everybody else's daughters are now going to get some equality on the battlefield. So and you won't have a choice in this, and this is already legal. Okay, now what they have done to really kind of seal the deal to get ready for the shooting war is basically by and they didn't do this in Afghanistan when the Russians back in the 1970s, early 1980s, when they didn't make anything official. It was all proxy war. Basically, you know, the CIA gave weapons to the Mujahideen. It taught them how to use Stinger missiles. Hence why in Desert Storm, Stinger missiles were shooting down Apache helicopters. They were wondering, you know, at first, you know, everybody was thinking it was friendly fire incidents, and then they realized, no, these jihadists have American-made weapons. Where did they get them? You know, that's usually the first thing you have to question about any of these wars that you see anywhere. These wars would not be possible if it wasn't for big governments funding them. You know, yeah, even these guys over in the Middle East, if you stop giving them ammo, you know, those AKs will just become really fancy clubs. And now that they have even fancier clubs, M16s, American-made M16s, people got to ask, well, where did they get those? You know, and the first it's going to be, oh, well, they raided weapons caches that were left behind when the U.S. left Iraq. But here's the problem with that, is that what, the Army leaves and they just leave all their weapons there? No, they didn't. They gave these weapons to people that they trained. Basically, we train the people we fight in the future. And we'll be doing this again in Ukraine. Ukraine is the line in the sand for the Russians. If this isn't a bluff and they're just trying to get regime change in Russia or regional European war going, they don't realize the miscalculation that this is going to lead to. Yes, the Russians will put up. They won't shut up. They will put up. Yes, they will launch nuclear weapons. Now, the thing is this. What kind of makes this proxy war, right now it's a proxy war between Russia and the United States. This is the first time you've had a kind of extremely direct proxy war, where yes, you know, the war against Afghanistan, the Russians had against Afghanistan was covert between the CIA and the